Hi, and welcome to Hill and Ponton's VA Disability Blog. I'm Natalia Joffrey, our company COO.
And I'm attorney Melanie Williams.
Today we're going to be talking about a pretty delicate issue. Melanie, I know that you wanted to forewarn people that...
Yes, we're going to be talking about MST, military sexual trauma. If you are a victim yourself, if this is something that is difficult for you to talk about, just be aware that, we're going to be talking about things that may trigger some of your symptoms. It may be very difficult to hear. So just make sure that you are taking care of yourself, getting the necessary treatment, seek help from a doctor, whatever you need to do to make sure that you are okay. So we are here to help you. We are here to provide, advice and things that we've seen in our practice. But most importantly, we want to make sure that our viewers are able to watch and learn with us.
Right. Thank you, Melanie, for doing that. We do acknowledge and recognize that this is a difficult topic to talk about and that it can affect people adversely. But we also want to empower people that need this information in order to be able to make decisions for themselves and for their claims. So, Melanie, for starters, if you could just reiterate MST. Military,
yes.
Yeah.
Military sexual trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So that means basically when a service member is involved in any kind of sexual activity against their own will.
Okay.
So it could be any form of being forced, whether physically coerced to do something they don't want to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's usually the most typical example that we think of.
Mm-hmm.
But it could also be if someone was threatened, to suffer negative consequences if they don't comply, with the sexual demands, or even if they were. If some kind of favorable treatment was implied for these, sexual behavior or activity. Also, if there is any kind of sexual activity when the person cannot physically consent. So if they are intoxicated, unconscious, anything in that scenario would count as military sexual trauma. And there are also other examples that we don't normally think of, though. Okay. So, for example, unwanted sexual touching or grabbing, any form of molestation, that counts as military sexual trauma. But even anything just verbal. So if, remarks or threats or any kind of speaking about someone else's body or sexual activities, anything like that, things that we would call sexual harassment, that falls under military sexual trauma as well.
And is that the way the VA defines it as well, or how does the VA define it?
That is within the VA's definition.
That is within the VA's definition. And I know it can be very difficult because when I've spoken with victims of military sexual trauma, they've told me that it was inherently very difficult because there's this semblance of, I don't want to say consent, but it was like an implied force because, oftentimes it was someone that was above them that was, the perpetrator. And in the military, you're taught that, whatever your commanding officer tells you to do, you have to do. The chain of command, the pressure of surrounding other people knowing about it, and sometimes it's not even one perpetrator. I mean, I know we've had several cases where there was several parties involved. Yes. So all of that falls under that umbrella.
Yes. Like you said, one of the most common examples is when it's a person in authority.
Thank you. That's what I couldn't verbalize what it was I wanted to say, and that's exactly it. Yes, a person in authority.
There is that implied, sense of pressure that's placed when that's the case, but it doesn't always have to be that. It doesn't have to be that there is someone, telling you to do something that's above you. It could be a peer or anyone else in any situation forcing you to do something that you don't want to do.
And the numbers are alarming. I mean, I was looking at this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but 1 in every 4 women
Yes.
have been victims of military sexual trauma.
Yes.
The service members, obviously, what we're talking about, and 1 in 100 men.
Yes.
And I think that that is a common issue or problem, that people think because we're talking about military sexual trauma that we're only talking about women, and that is really not the case. I mean, we've had many, many male clients that have been victims as well.
Absolutely. And keep in mind that those numbers come from a screening that's done at the VA. So that's only people who have sought treatment at the VA and who are willing to answer honestly and say yes. So the reality of it is the numbers are much, much higher than that.
There's
most likely.
Multitudes suffering in silence.
Exactly.
I think that is the reality.
And like you said, especially men, men tend to be more hesitant to come forward because of the stigma.
The stigma,
But anyone can be a victim, and it's not, it spreads gender, ages, it doesn't mean anything about you. If you yourself have suffered, it's not a reflection of you, it's something that happened. And so, we hope that we can take the shame away that's involved in that.
I love that you said that, because it's so true. People often think, what does this say about me? People are gonna think that I somehow invited this to happen, or that, if you're told you wanted this to happen, right? I mean, that is often what happens to victims is, well, you wanted this to happen, and things like that. And it's already very difficult for women. I'm not saying it's more difficult for men, but I think that for men in the military, the stigma is even greater, because they're afraid of the other implications in terms of their sexual orientation and what is this going to mean.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's important. Okay, Melanie. So let's talk about then, how can you get benefits based on MST?
Right. So MST is not something that you claim. It's the cause of a condition, or there's something that results from the MST. The result is what you are claiming, is what you are filing a claim for.
Give me an example.
So one of the most common conditions that results from MST is PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
So a mental condition, PTSD, depression. Yes.
Okay.
Things like that. There are also physical conditions that could result from MST, and so that would be something that you would claim. But MST is not a claim in and of itself. It's the cause of what you would be claiming.
Okay. So how would it benefit a person to come forward? Because it has to be worthwhile, right? I mean, this is a difficult thing to talk about and to be, to bring a claim for. I mean, I feel like someone can feel as if though it takes a toll on them, but they need to feel at the end of the day that sharing this story, filing this claim, having to relive all of this is worthwhile.
In that case, you are entitled to benefits from the VA.
Mm-hmm.
If it's something that happened to you in the military and you are suffering because of it, that is when you can file a claim. Mm-hmm. And these claims are not easy to win. I will say that it's usually it's an uphill battle because of the the way that the regulations are structured and everything, but it is possible, and that's what we're going to talk about, are some ways to help prove your claim.
So Melanie, I know that you said it can be an uphill battle, but to me, that should then be fuel for your fire. I know it can be exhausting to deal with this, talk about this, file a claim, but really sometimes things are just about justice, yes, in my opinion. And if you don't get the benefits that you merit because you didn't ask for this to happen to you, this happened to you, I think that should propel you to come forward and get the benefits that you're due as a result of this, like you would any other injury or any other, situation that caused you to have PTSD.
Right, absolutely. What I hear from a lot of veterans is it's not about the money, it's about the VA admitting what happened to me.
Yeah.
And sometimes, the VA may grant you service connection, but they may not outright say what happened to you. So it's important to keep in mind what it is that you want out of this whole thing. And, you know, if you are granted service connection, that means you won. That means that, you know, you have established what it was that happened to you in service that's causing what you're dealing with now.
It's the closest you're going to get to an acknowledgement and an apology,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
I used to, well, many years ago when we did liability cases, an attorney said this to me, and it rings true to this day. People often file claims in the world of litigation because they want an apology. They want them to come out and say, I'm sorry this happened to you, I'm sorry you suffered this injury, I'm sorry you're having to live with this, so on and so forth. Right. The truth is, insurance companies don't apologize. So the apology comes in the form of a check. Yeah. The acknowledgement and the compensation for what you've had to go through and continue to live with. And I think that that's what applies here as well.
Absolutely.
That's as close as you're going to get.
Yes.
So how do you prove a claim?
Yes. So let's say you file a claim for PTSD. Remember, to establish service connection, you need something that happened in service, you need a current condition, and a nexus. PTSD is one of those conditions where you need to you know, prove your stressor. They're not just going to take your word for it of what happened to you in service. However, MST is one of those exceptions where they are more lenient because the VA understands that not everybody is going to, you know, file a report or you know, in service, report what it was that happened.
Right.
Sometimes I know it even happens that you do report your MST and nothing comes of it. It's not in your records anywhere. Nobody did anything about it. And so that's also something that happens a lot. So there are other things that the VA will look for in service records to help show or establish that this happened. These are called markers.
Okay. And I know we've talked a lot about buddy statements in prior videos, and I've heard about that or seen those applied. Can you explain how a buddy statement would be used in an MST case?
Absolutely. So the most straightforward example would be if someone saw the event happened, if someone witnessed you know, the harassment or the treatment or the incident, getting them to write a statement about, you know, what they saw and what they witnessed, that would be the most helpful. But again, in most cases, there isn't a witness.
Right.
So there are other ways that you can use buddy statements. So was there someone that you told about the incident? You know, after it happened, while you were in service? Did you tell friends that you had, family members? You know, did you call back home and tell them about what happened? Any of these people could write in a statement and talk about what they heard from you.
Right.
Another example is, you know, along with those markers, things that changed about you. So if before service, you were outgoing and friendly and social and had no problems, but then in service, you started acting differently, or when you came back home from service, you weren't the same, and your family members noticed or your friends noticed, they can write a statement about those changes that they saw. And you know, kind of paint the picture of you had no problems before service, and then all of a sudden something happened where you were not the same person anymore.
I've seen those a lot regarding change in demeanor.
Yes.
And I've seen buddy statements where they said, you know, she came home for Mother's Day and everything was great and everything was normal. And then when she came back, you know, for Thanksgiving, she was like a completely different person.
Yes.
You know, somber and sad, and we knew something was wrong, but we didn't know what it was, or
Right.
something to that effect.
Right.
So that can be as useful in a buddy statement.
Yes, absolutely.
Or at least a piece of evidence.
Right, right.
Okay.
Along those lines, other things that you'll want to look for in service records are any other examples of that change in behavior. So if all of a sudden you started having disciplinary action, so you had no problems before, and then, you know, you're showing up late to work, or you're going AWOL, or you have an Article 15, all of those are examples of things that your behavior changed. There was something that affected you. substance abuse problems. If all of a sudden you start drinking more than usual, you start using drugs, and somebody can talk about that and talk about how they saw that, that's an example of a marker. If you request to transfer your workstation, if you request to transfer to a different unit, that is a prime example of clearly something happened where you don't want to be where you are anymore. Usually, more likely than not, it's because you are with somebody who did something to you, and so you want to get away from that person.
Right.
So all of these are things that you can look for. Even journal entries. If at the time when this happened, you had a journal and you were diarying about things that happened to you, you can use that to submit the VA as evidence of what happened.
Wow. So all of this to say that even if you didn't report it at the time or even at a later time, you could still have a claim.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I think that's really important for people to know, is that it's really never too late.
Right.
Anything else you want to add regarding the benefits or anything?
Just again, don't be afraid to come forward. Make sure that you're taking care of yourself and getting the treatment that you need. And requesting your service records, carefully going through your service records. Was there any change in your performance? Can anyone talk about the change that you experienced? All of those things can point to what it was that happened. And just don't be afraid to come forward and reach out to us. We deal with these cases on a daily basis. And so we're here to help as best as we can.
Great. Thanks, Melanie. Appreciate it. Thanks for joining us. We hope you'll join us again. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to visit our website or call our office.